He thought the badge on his chest gave him the right to decide who belonged on that road. But in less than a minute, the night would remind him that power and judgment were never the same thing. The flashing red and blue lights painted long streaks across the dark Georgia highway as the black SUV eased onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires in the stillness after midnight. Inside the vehicle, Ethan Brooks kept both hands on the steering wheel, steady and visible, the dashboard glow tracing the tension in his jaw without breaking the calm in his face. Beside him, Naomi Brooks turned slightly toward the passenger window, her posture composed, her breathing even, her eyes focused not on fear, but on the kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly how quickly a quiet night can turn into something else. They had been driving home from downtown Atlanta, the city skyline already miles behind them. The warmth of a simple dinner still lingering in the car, along with the soft scent of Naomi's perfume and the faint notes of old jazz humming low through the speakers. It should have been an ordinary ride back. 10 more minutes, maybe less, and they would have been home. But ordinary has a way of disappearing when prejudice sees dark skin before it sees people. The patrol cruiser stopped behind them with a sharp beam of white light cutting through the rear window, turning the inside of the SUV into a stage. Ethan glanced once at Naomi, not because he needed guidance, but because in that single look they said everything married people learn to say without words. Stay calm. Stay still. Let him talk. Naomi gave the smallest nod, then faced forward again, one hand resting lightly over her purse, her expression unreadable in the wash of police lights. Outside, Officer Ryan Mercer stepped from his cruiser and adjusted his duty belt, as if preparing for a situation far more dangerous than a couple driving home in a clean black SUV. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the stiff confidence of a man too accustomed to being obeyed and too comfortable making assumptions before asking questions. His flashlight beam slid across the license plate, then the back glass, then settled hard on the driver's side mirror. The road around them was empty except for a passing 18-wheeler in the distance and the low hiss of wind moving across dry grass. It felt, for a second, like the whole world had stepped back to watch. Ethan lowered the window halfway before Ryan even reached the door. "Evening, officer," he said, voice level, respectful, controlled. But Ryan did not answer right away. He leaned slightly, shining the flashlight into Ethan's face, then Naomi's, then into the back seat, lingering just long enough to make it clear this stop was about more than a traffic check. His silence did what words often cannot. It accused. It measured. It stripped away the benefit of the doubt before either of them had done a thing. Naomi could feel it immediately, that old familiar shift in the air, the one that turned a public servant into a gatekeeper and a roadside stop into a quiet test of dignity. Ryan took a half step back and finally spoke, his tone clipped and cold. "License, registration, and tell me why you two are out here this late." Ethan reached slowly toward the center console, but before he could open it, Naomi's gaze flicked toward the side mirror. Far down the highway, almost swallowed by darkness, a pair of headlights appeared and held steady. She looked at her watch, then back at the officer, and for the first time that night, something almost imperceptible changed in her eyes. Ryan did not notice it. He was too busy believing he was the one in control. Officer Ryan Mercer kept the flashlight trained inside the SUV a moment longer, as if he were waiting for something suspicious to rise out of the leather seats and prove whatever story he had already written in his head. Ethan Brooks handed over his license with 2 fingers, slow and careful, then reached for the registration from the glove compartment only after making the movement obvious enough to avoid giving the officer an excuse to harden the stop any further. Naomi remained still, her purse resting on her lap, her eyes forward, calm in a way that almost seemed to irritate Ryan more than fear ever could. He took the documents without a thank you and glanced down at the names. "Brooks," he muttered, then looked back at Ethan. "This your vehicle?" The question landed with a tone that suggested the answer had already been judged before it was spoken. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "It is registered to my wife." Ryan's eyes shifted immediately to Naomi, and something in his expression changed, not because her answer mattered, but because the idea of her owning a late-model SUV on a quiet stretch of highway after midnight did not fit whatever narrow picture he preferred to carry around in place of reality. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, sharp and flat. Ethan blinked once, then kept his voice measured. "Officer, is there a reason?" Ryan gave a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "I do not need to debate procedure with you on the side of the road. I asked you to step out." The night around them seemed to tighten. A gust of wind brushed along the shoulder, carrying the smell of hot pavement and pine from the tree line beyond the ditch. Somewhere overhead, the faint chop of a news helicopter moved across the distance, too far away to matter, and yet somehow adding to the sense that this moment was being watched by more than the empty road. Ethan opened the door carefully and stood beside the SUV, keeping his hands visible, his shoulders squared but loose. Ryan circled him with the flashlight, not quite searching, not quite inspecting, but performing the kind of authority meant less to protect the public than to remind someone who is allowed to feel comfortable and who is not. Naomi watched through the windshield, her face unreadable, but inside she was counting every word, every pause, every overreach. Ryan asked where they had been, where they were going, how long they had owned the car, whether there was anything illegal in the vehicle, whether Ethan had ever been arrested. The questions came one after another, not because the stop required them, but because power enjoys hearing itself echoed back in forced answers. Ethan responded with the same quiet control each time, refusing to hand over anger, refusing to become the version of himself Ryan seemed desperate to provoke. That restraint only made Ryan colder. He turned toward the passenger side and tapped the flashlight against Naomi's window. "You too," he said. "Out of the car." Naomi lowered the glass the rest of the way and met his stare with a stillness that carried more weight than defiance. "Officer Mercer," she said softly, reading his nameplate in a tone so composed it nearly disappeared into the wind. "Before we go any further, are you certain this is the direction you want to take?" For the first time, Ryan frowned not with authority, but with confusion. Behind him, those distant headlights Naomi had noticed earlier were no longer far away. They were coming closer now, steady and deliberate, sliding through the darkness like they had been expected all along. Ryan Mercer followed Naomi's gaze for only a second before dismissing what he saw in the distance as irrelevant. But that was the thing about men who got too comfortable with control. They rarely noticed the moment control began slipping away. The approaching headlights remained low and steady, not speeding, not weaving, just moving with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew exactly where they were headed. Ryan turned back toward Naomi and let out a dry breath through his nose, the kind that carried more irritation than confidence now. "Ma'am, I asked you to step out of the vehicle," he said. Naomi opened the door with deliberate calm and stood beside the SUV, smoothing the front of her charcoal coat against the night breeze as if she were stepping into a lobby instead of a roadside stop that had long since crossed the line into something personal. She was not tall, but the stillness in her posture made her seem unshakable. Ryan noticed it, and he did not like it. People like him preferred nervous voices, shaky hands, rushed explanations. Calm had a way of making arrogance feel exposed. Ethan remained near the driver's side, close enough to Naomi to remind Ryan that they were together, far enough to avoid giving him a reason to speak over either of them. For a few seconds no one said anything. The cruiser lights kept turning, washing the road in color, red then blue, like a warning the dark countryside could not quite understand. Ryan looked from Ethan to Naomi, then down the empty highway, then back again. "You two always travel this late?" he asked. "We travel when we need to," Naomi replied. Her voice was quiet, polished, unmistakably educated, but there was no arrogance in it. Only precision. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Funny," he said, "because people who have nothing to hide do not usually answer simple questions with attitude." Ethan turned his head slightly, the muscles in his face tightening for the first time. "She did not give you attitude," he said. "She answered you." Ryan took a step closer, not enough to touch, just enough to crowd the space and remind them what kind of officer he believed himself to be. "I will decide what counts as attitude out here." Imagine standing on the side of an American highway, under cold flashing lights, knowing the wrong tone could become the wrong move, and the wrong move could become a story no one would tell honestly later. Naomi knew that feeling. Ethan knew it too. That was why they stayed measured, why their silence carried discipline instead of surrender. Ryan raised the flashlight again, but his hand hesitated when the dark SUV behind them finally drew close enough for its shape to emerge. It was not a civilian vehicle. Black, government issue, clean lines, tinted windows, moving with the unmistakable posture of authority that does not need to announce itself. It rolled past slowly, then stopped several yards ahead on the shoulder. Ryan stared. The driver's door did not open. No one rushed out. That somehow unsettled him more. Naomi glanced at the vehicle once, then back to Ryan, and there was something almost merciful in the way she spoke next. "Officer Mercer," she said, "you still have a chance to handle this professionally." He frowned hard now, his confidence no longer smooth. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" Naomi did not answer right away. Instead, she reached into her purse with slow, unmistakable care, holding his gaze the entire time. Ethan did not move. The wind moved through the grass. The lights from both vehicles cut long shadows across the shoulder. Then Naomi drew out a slim leather case and held it, closed in her hand, not yet showing him what was inside, only letting the possibility of it settle into the silence between them. Ryan Mercer stared at the leather case in Naomi Brooks's hand as though the answer might change depending on how long he delayed seeing it. The wind moved across the roadside in a slow sweep, carrying dust and the faint scent of pine, while the black government SUV ahead remained still, engine running, headlights cutting a pale line across the shoulder. Ethan Brooks did not speak. He knew better than to interrupt a moment that was already doing its own work. Ryan, however, was not ready to surrender the illusion that this stop belonged to him. "Put that away," he said, his voice sharper now, less controlled than before. "I did not ask for anything from your purse." Naomi's expression did not shift. "No," she said quietly. "You asked for compliance. I am offering you clarity." That sentence landed harder than Ryan expected. For a second, the silence around them became almost physical. The flashing lights from the cruiser washed over Naomi's face, then receded, then returned again, and each time they did, Ryan seemed to see a little more of what had been in front of him all along, but had never fit the version of the story he preferred. She was not rattled. She was not confused. She was not trying to talk her way out of anything. She was waiting, and there is something deeply unsettling about a person who can wait without fear while someone else is busy proving too much. Ryan let out a breath and glanced toward his cruiser, toward the radio, toward the empty highway behind him, as if searching for reinforcement from the world itself. "This is a lawful stop," he said, straightening his shoulders. "You were both acting suspiciously." Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Driving home?" he asked. "That is what counts as suspicious." Ryan turned on him immediately. "I am talking to her." But Naomi answered before Ethan could, her voice remaining level, even gentle. "You were talking to your assumptions long before you were talking to either of us, Officer Mercer." That did it. A line in Ryan's face hardened, not because he had been threatened, but because he had been named too accurately. Men like him could survive complaints, disputes, even witnesses. What they struggled with was being seen clearly. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough to try and reclaim the air around them. "Open it," he said. Naomi looked at the leather case in her hand, then back at him. "You are sure?" she asked. The question was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It sounded almost courteous, and that made it worse. Ryan swallowed once. "Open it." Naomi flipped the case open with one smooth motion. The gold caught the light first, then the seal, then the identification beneath it. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, nothing moved. Not Ryan. Not Ethan. Not even the wind, it seemed. The night itself felt suspended, like the road had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Ryan's flashlight dipped an inch before he corrected it. His eyes moved from the badge to Naomi's face, then back again, as if searching for some small flaw that would restore him to the center of the story. There was none. Naomi held the badge steady and spoke with the same calm she had shown from the start. "Special Agent Naomi Brooks," she said, "and you have made this stop far more complicated than it needed to be." Behind them, the black SUV's front doors finally opened. Two figures stepped out in dark jackets, moving with the unmistakable composure of people who did not need to raise their voices to take over a scene. Ryan's mouth parted, but no words came. The confidence that had carried him onto this shoulder minutes earlier was still there in form, but not in substance. It looked the same from a distance. Up close, it was already collapsing. The two figures from the black SUV moved with quiet authority, their jackets shifting in the beam of the patrol lights as they approached the shoulder without urgency and without doubt. One was a tall black man in his 50s with silver at his temples and the kind of composure that made people instinctively lower their voices around him. The other was a younger woman with a tablet in one hand and an earpiece visible beneath neatly pulled back hair, her eyes already taking in the cruiser number, the position of the vehicles, and the body camera mounted on Ryan Mercer's chest. Ryan looked from Naomi Brooks to the newcomers and then back again, as though his mind were still trying to rearrange the scene into something manageable. "What is this?" he asked, but the question had lost its edge. Naomi closed the badge case slowly, not to hide it, but because she no longer needed to prove anything. "This," she said, "is the moment you should start choosing your words very carefully." Ethan Brooks remained where he was, his hands relaxed at his sides now, though the tightness in his expression had not fully left. Relief was there, yes, but so was something older, something heavier. Anyone who had lived long enough under suspicion understood that being proven right did not erase what it cost to endure being doubted in the first place. The older man stepped forward and offered Naomi a brief nod. "Special Agent Brooks," he said. "We picked up the delay and came as soon as we confirmed the location." His voice was low, controlled, unmistakably federal. Ryan's posture changed almost instantly. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but in small involuntary ways that told the truth faster than his mouth could. His shoulders lost their square confidence. His chin dropped half an inch. Even the flashlight in his hand seemed suddenly unnecessary, like a prop from an argument that no longer had an audience. "I did not know," he said, looking at Naomi, then Ethan, then nowhere at all. Naomi's answer came without heat. "That is exactly the problem." The younger agent moved toward the cruiser and glanced at the dash camera, then at Ryan's chest mount, then down at her tablet. "Recording indicators are active," she said. "Timestamp is clean." Those words fell into the night with a weight Ryan could not ignore. He opened his mouth as if to explain, but he still had not found a version of the stop that did not begin with the same thing he could no longer defend. He had seen a black couple on a dark highway in a nice vehicle and decided suspicion before evidence, pressure before courtesy, control before professionalism. He had mistaken bias for instinct, and procedure for permission. Naomi looked at him steadily. "You asked my husband if this was his vehicle," she said. "You asked why we were out this late. You treated ownership like a contradiction and presence like a threat. Do you understand how clear that looks from where we are standing?" Ryan swallowed. The highway seemed quieter now, the passing traffic thinner, the air cooler somehow. Even the rotating patrol lights looked different, less like symbols of command and more like witnesses that could not look away. Ethan finally spoke, and his voice carried none of the anger Ryan probably expected, only the exhaustion of a truth repeated too many times in too many places. "You did not stop a problem tonight," he said. "You created one because you saw us before you saw anything else." Ryan said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would sound smaller than what had already been shown. The older agent took one slow step closer, his expression unreadable. "Officer Mercer," he said, "for everyone's sake, I suggest you stop thinking about what you meant and start thinking about what you did." And under those red and blue lights, on that lonely stretch of Georgia highway, Ryan finally understood that the road beneath his boots had shifted. He was no longer the one holding the scene together. He was the reason it had come apart. Ryan Mercer stood beneath the wash of his own patrol lights, as though the uniform on his back had suddenly become heavier than it was built to carry. He glanced once toward the younger federal agent near his cruiser, then at the older man, then finally at Naomi Brooks, as if hoping one of them might offer him a smaller version of what this night had become. None of them did. The road remained quiet except for the low hum of engines and the occasional rush of air from a passing car in the far lane, each one moving past without knowing that on this narrow shoulder, a man who had begun the stop believing he controlled the truth was now being forced to stand inside it. Naomi held herself with the same measured calm she had shown from the first moment he approached the window. There was no triumph in her face, no raised voice, no performance of revenge. That was what unsettled Ryan most. He had prepared himself for outrage, for accusation, for a scene he could later describe as emotional or excessive. What he had not prepared for was discipline. What he had not prepared for was a black woman who did not need to prove her dignity, because she had never once surrendered it. The older federal agent introduced himself at last. "Supervising Agent Daniel Hayes," he said, his tone even, his gaze fixed on Ryan with the kind of patience that made dishonesty feel childish before it was even attempted. Special Agent Brooks and her husband were en route to support an active federal matter. Your stop interrupted that movement. Before we decide what happens next, I would suggest complete honesty. Ryan nodded too quickly, then caught himself. "I ran the plates," he said. "I was doing my job." Agent Hayes did not react. "That explains procedure," he said. "It does not explain tone. It does not explain assumptions. And it certainly does not explain why two law-abiding people ended up standing on a roadside answering questions that had nothing to do with public safety." Ethan Brooks looked out across the dark tree line while those words settled. There was a tiredness in his face now that had not been there at dinner, not because the night had become dangerous in any obvious way, but because humiliation does not need noise to leave a mark. Sometimes all it takes is being made to feel like your presence requires explanation. He turned back toward Ryan and spoke softly, almost sadly. "You know what the hardest part is? It is not even being stopped. It is realizing how early you decided what kind of people we were." Ryan looked at him then, really looked, perhaps for the first time all night. He saw the pressed collar, the wedding band, the controlled breathing, the patience he had mistaken for weakness. He saw Naomi's composure, the kind that comes from years of competence in rooms that still question it on sight. And somewhere in that long second, the road gave him back a truth he had spent too long outrunning. He had not responded to behavior. He had responded to bias and dressed it up as instinct. The younger agent near the cruiser spoke without looking up from her tablet. "Body camera audio is clear from first contact," she said. Dash footage captured the full approach. Ryan closed his eyes for half a beat. Not long enough to hide, just long enough to feel the weight of evidence when it is no longer abstract. Naomi stepped closer, her voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying the full authority of someone who had no interest in humiliating him, only in making sure the moment was seen for what it was. "Tonight is not about whether you recognized a badge," she said. "It is about why you only started respecting us after you did." That question stayed in the air between them, heavier than any siren, sharper than any reprimand. And for the first time since he stepped out of his cruiser, Ryan Mercer had no place to hide from it. Ryan Mercer did not answer Naomi Brooks right away because some questions do not leave room for a clean response. They do not ask what happened. They ask who you were when it happened, and whether you are willing to meet that version of yourself in the open. The red and blue lights continued their slow rotation across the shoulder, sweeping over polished metal, dark asphalt, federal jackets, and the face of a man who now understood that the most damaging part of the night was not the stop itself, but the truth buried inside the way it began. Supervising Agent Daniel Hayes let the silence stretch just long enough to make clear that no one was going to rescue Ryan from the consequences of his own words. Then he turned slightly toward the younger agent by the cruiser. "Contact local command," he said. "Advise them we have a professional conduct concern involving Officer Ryan Mercer. Request a field supervisor to this location immediately." The younger agent nodded and spoke into her earpiece, her voice low and efficient, while Ryan's expression shifted again, this time not with disbelief, but with the first visible sign of fear. Not panic, not outrage, something quieter. The fear of a man realizing that this night would not stay on the side of the road. Ethan Brooks watched him with a look that held no satisfaction, only weariness. "This is how it happens," he said softly. "Not always with shouting. Not always with headlines. Sometimes it is just a person with a badge deciding your explanation matters less than their suspicion." Ryan looked at Ethan, then lowered his eyes. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the problem was larger than a bad stop or a poor choice of words. The problem was that he had walked toward that driver's side window already prepared to doubt, already prepared to interpret confidence as disrespect and ownership as inconsistency. Naomi stood beside her husband, one hand resting lightly near her coat pocket, the other hanging at her side, her posture unchanged. "Do you know why people lose trust in uniforms?" she asked. "It is not because officers make mistakes. It is because too many people can feel when the mistake was not random." Her voice remained calm, but it carried across the shoulder with a steadiness that no siren could interrupt. Hayes glanced toward the dark tree line and then back to Ryan. "Special Agent Brooks is right," he said. "Everyone on this road knows you did not begin with evidence. You began with a conclusion. Everything after that was you trying to justify it." Ryan's throat moved as he swallowed. He opened his mouth, stopped, then finally managed, "I should have handled it differently." Naomi's eyes did not soften, but neither did they harden. "Differently is not the word," she said. "Fairly is." That landed with a finality that seemed to change the air itself. In the distance, another set of flashing lights approached, slower than a pursuit, faster than routine. "Local command." Ryan heard it too. His shoulders sank almost imperceptibly. Imagine standing there and realizing the night you thought would prove your authority was now the night that would expose your character. Imagine understanding that respect had been available from the very beginning, and that you withheld it until power wore a form you recognized. Ethan took a slow breath and looked down the empty highway where they should have been driving home by now. "We were just trying to get home," he said. The words were simple, but they held the whole weight of the evening inside them. And as the incoming lights grew brighter, washing over the shoulder in a second layer of truth, Ryan Mercer finally understood that what had arrived was not just supervision. It was accountability. The local supervisor arrived in a marked unit with no siren, just a revolving wash of amber and blue that rolled across the shoulder and settled over the scene like a second judgment. Sergeant Melissa Grant stepped out into the cool Georgia night with a notepad in one hand and the kind of face that did not waste expressions. She took in everything before asking a single question. The patrol cruiser angled too close behind the SUV, Ryan Mercer standing a little too stiff, the federal vehicle ahead, the agents on scene, the black couple still waiting on a roadside where they should never have had to prove they belonged. Supervising Agent Daniel Hayes met her halfway, spoke low, and handed over the broad outline in less than a minute. Grant listened without interrupting, her eyes moving once toward Ryan, then to Naomi Brooks, then briefly to Ethan Brooks, who stood with the controlled fatigue of a man trying not to let the insult of the night settle too deeply in his bones. When Hayes finished, Sergeant Grant walked directly to Ryan. "Turn off your body camera only when instructed by protocol," she said. "Until then, keep your hands visible and say nothing beyond answering direct questions." Ryan nodded, but the movement looked smaller now, the sort of nod a man gives when the chain of command no longer feels like protection. Grant asked for the reason for the stop. Ryan gave one. She asked what specific violation initiated the encounter. He hesitated. That hesitation did more damage than any dramatic confession could have. Grant's face did not change, but something in the silence around her sharpened. "So the vehicle was not reported stolen," she said. "There was no active warrant tied to the plate. There was no dispatch advisory, no visible impairment, no confirmed traffic offense of significance. And yet you escalated this into a roadside detention of two private citizens on their way home." Ryan tried to explain it as instinct, as late night, caution, as officer awareness. But every sentence sounded weaker than the one before it, because even he could hear what those words had become over time when spoken by the wrong person in the wrong moment. Naomi stood a few feet away, saying nothing, letting the facts do what outrage no longer needed to do. The younger federal agent finished noting the body camera timestamps and transferred a short summary to Hayes, who passed the information to Sergeant Grant without comment. It was all there, not only in footage, but in sequence. The approach, the tone, the unsupported suspicion, the shift in respect after the badge. Grant looked at Ryan for a long second that felt like an entire report being written in real time. "Officer Mercer," she said at last, effective immediately, "I am removing you from further roadside activity, pending review. Hand over your unit keys and step back from this scene." No one gasped. No one needed to. Accountability does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives in a calm voice and a simple instruction that leaves no room for argument. Ryan reached slowly toward his belt, unclipped the keys, and placed them in her hand. The tiny metallic sound they made was almost nothing, but on that empty stretch of highway it carried like a verdict. Ethan watched the exchange and felt no triumph, only a quiet, complicated relief. It did not erase the stop. It did not return the lost minutes or the old exhaustion that moments like this always reopened. But it mattered. Naomi turned toward him, her expression gentler now, and for the first time all night the tension in her shoulders eased. Sergeant Grant then faced the couple directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," she said, "you should have been treated with professionalism from the start. You were not. That failure is being documented tonight." Under the flashing lights and the wide dark sky, the road finally began to feel honest again, not because the damage had vanished, but because it had been named. For a few seconds after Sergeant Melissa Grant spoke, no one moved. The highway seemed to pause with them, the dark shoulder holding the last of the flashing lights while the rest of the world kept moving somewhere beyond the tree line. Ethan Brooks stood beside Naomi and let the words settle slowly, not because he doubted them, but because he had heard too many versions of concern in his life that never turned into consequence. Tonight felt different, not because the stop had not happened, not because the sting of it had vanished, but because, for once, the truth had not been smoothed over, redirected, or buried beneath procedure. It had been seen in full view, under cameras, under command, under a sky too wide to hide beneath. Ryan Mercer remained a few steps back, no longer at the center of anything, his shoulders lower now, his silence heavier than all the questions he had asked when he still thought suspicion was the same thing as authority. He looked like a man trying to understand when the night turned against him, but the answer had been there from the beginning. It turned the moment he forgot that a badge is meant to serve people, not sort them. Naomi Brooks looked at him one last time, not with hatred, not even with anger now, but with the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper because it leaves no room for excuses. "You know what makes moments like this so dangerous?" she said, her voice calm enough to make everyone listen. "It is not just that someone gets delayed on the side of the road. It is that dignity gets treated like it can be suspended until proven worthy." No one interrupted. Even the wind seemed to quiet around her. She stepped closer to Ethan, and the nearness between them carried something steadier than relief. It was trust, the kind built long before tonight and tested again in the glow of someone else's prejudice. Ethan looked down the road where their headlights still pointed home, and when he spoke, his voice was low and unshaken. "We were never asking for special treatment," he said. "Just equal treatment. That should not depend on a badge, a title, or who shows up behind us." Sergeant Grant gave a single nod, as if she understood that the statement was larger than this roadside stop and older than everyone standing there. Agent Daniel Hayes folded his hands in front of him and glanced once toward the patrol cruiser, then back at Ryan. "Respect that arrives late is not respect," he said. "It is fear of consequence." That line hung in the air with the weight of final truth. Ryan lowered his head, not dramatically, just enough to show that somewhere inside the collapse of his certainty, recognition had finally begun. Maybe it would change him. Maybe it would not. Not every lesson becomes transformation. But some nights leave a mark too clear to ignore, and this would be one of them. Naomi reached for the passenger door, then paused and looked back across the shoulder. The cruisers, the federal vehicle, the road, the lights, the silence, all of it now arranged around one simple fact that should never have required proof. "The real badge was never the one in my hand," she said softly. "It was the character you showed before you knew who I was." Then she got into the SUV. Ethan followed, and a moment later the engine settled into a quiet hum that sounded almost gentle after everything the night had carried. As the black vehicle pulled back onto the highway and its taillights disappeared into the dark, the flashing lights behind them looked smaller somehow, dimmer, less certain of themselves. And on that lonely stretch of Georgia road, one truth remained long after the engines faded. He pulled them over because of what he saw, but he fell because of what he refused to see.